Good afternoon, beloved. I'm Dr. Henry Johnson, pastor of Holiday United Church of Christ in Holiday, Florida. And this is our 9th podcast for this year. As I've mentioned so many times before, we started these podcasts as a way of giving you some ideas, some things that you could use to be more productive during this pandemic time. And from a personal standpoint, I hope that we were successful. I hope that we've given you some things to talk about, to think about, to share with other people. To that end, though, I thought maybe today we ought to talk about guilt and shame. Yeah, guilt and shame. We've all felt them. Come on, guys. We have. In fact, research tells us that the only people who don't feel shame are sociopaths. So I guess you have a choice. You can either tell people, yes, I have a little shame, or I'm a sociopath. One or the other. You get your choice. So for those who are not sociopaths, you understand what I'm talking about when we talk about guilt and shame. But the way people use the two terms, you would think they were synonyms, that they meant the same thing, that in just in common usage, you would think that guilt and shame are both the same thing, but in reality they aren't. In fact, there's a huge difference between guilt and shame. And the difference lies in what they are reflecting. Let me help you out with this. Guilt is a reflection of behavior. Shame is something you feel about yourself. So, how many of you, if you made a mistake, let's think about this. How many of you, if you made a mistake, would go up to someone and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? See, that's guilt. If you're feeling guilty, you would go up and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. But shame, you would say, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. It's frequently, I have seen in a number of writings, where people have referred to shame as the cesspool of the soul. And that could very well be. Shame is something that is very internal. It's the way we see ourselves. And it's a direct reflection of how we see ourselves. Whereas guilt is realizing that this is the way things should be. I did something that may have possibly hurt another person. Therefore, I feel badly. So guilt is something I do to someone else, whereas shame is something I do to myself. Let me give you an example. Maybe this will clarify it a little bit more. I remember many years ago when I was teaching in elementary school. One day I went to work and the teacher down the hall wasn't in her classroom, and I was told that she was having to take time off because she had just had a baby. And I felt really stupid because I had no idea she was even pregnant. I mean, she's somebody I work with, and I didn't notice. And so I felt this terrible sense of shame that I would be so blind to people around me, that I would not be focused on all of the details, things that need to be noticed. And so I felt this terrible sense of shame. Well, as it turns out, that night I was going to a large meeting, and it was in an auditorium. And you know what auditoriums are like. You sitting right next to people. And I sat down next to this woman who was very, very large. And so once the meeting got started, I wanted to demonstrate that I was very aware of my surroundings and that I was trying to be empathetic to this lady and noticed that she was pregnant. And so I leaned over to her and I said, "When is your baby due?" And she looked at me and she said, "I'm not pregnant." At that moment, I felt guilt. Huge difference between the two. And it's like you want the whole world to just open up and swallow you at that moment, because you can't get away. There's no place you can go. You can't say, "Oh, excuse me," and get up and leave. You're stuck. You have to sit there. And now I'm sitting next to this poor woman that I have just offended, and I didn't mean to offend her. I was trying to impress her. I was trying to impress her with the fact that I was very cognizant of my surroundings and the people around me. I had the best of intentions, but the outcome wasn't what I had wanted it to be. So we can see that there's a huge difference between shame and guilt. Shame is extremely deleterious. It tears you apart. And it's interesting, a lot of the research that, let me go back just for a moment. One of my favorite authors is a woman by the name of Brené Brown. If you have a chance, Google Brené Brown, and look at some of her TED Talks, because she's a very, very good speaker, tremendous speaker. And she's done a lot of research into shame and guilt, and especially shame. And one of the things she discovered in her research, and this research has been going on for 16 years, so this is extensive amount of data. One of the things she discovered was that women have shame connected to a lot of different things. Women have shame connected to housework, connected to meals that they cook, connected to their family, connected to their ability to raise children, connected to their ability to control children. All of these things, all of these aspects that women feel they should be perfect at. And these are tapes. By the way, let's not quibble about it. These are tapes that ladies are given from the time they're very young. So they have shame associated with all of these different areas, because if you're not perfect, you feel shame. And of course, perfection is it's impossible. So ladies have a lot of things that they have connected with shame. For men, there's only one thing, and I bet you can guess what it is. For men, they have shame connected to weakness. That's all. And so for a man, anytime he feels a sense of weakness or lesser than, he feels a sense of shame. And that's interesting. It's interesting, and it's probably something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the connection between guilt and shame, because there is a connection. There is a point where these two come together, and that point is called vulnerability. Vulnerability, according to Brené Brown, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and courage. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and courage. But so many of us are afraid to be vulnerable, because if I'm vulnerable, I'm going to feel shame. Maybe I'm going to feel guilt. If I'm vulnerable, what do I say? I'll hate myself if I fail. Failure. Oh, there's a great topic. We could talk about failure all night long. Failure typically comes from a situation where you were vulnerable. But so does greatness. So does greatness. Vulnerability is a state where, yes, you can fail, but you can also succeed greatly. And it's the only place where you can demonstrate creativity and where you can demonstrate great courage. Now, you ask any man if he associates vulnerability with courage, most women as well. Do you associate vulnerability with courage? And they'll say, no, two different things. And yet, ask any soldier on a battlefield about vulnerability. There is no courage without vulnerability. And there's no more vulnerable place to be than on a battlefield. And people are shooting at you. That's vulnerability. And yet that's also the place where we find great courage. So vulnerability gets a bad rap. And if we stop and we take a look at why people are not willing to allow themselves to be vulnerable, it's because I have to take a look at myself. And I have to say to myself, it's okay to fail. At least I tried. And for some people, that's unacceptable. If you're a lady and you have to be perfect in a variety of areas, if you have to be perfect at raising your children, and your children turn out somewhat less than perfect, there it is, shame. I'm going to feel shame. If you're fixing a meal and you're putting a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of energy into this meal, and the meal isn't all that you expected it to be, you were vulnerable. You were creating. You were being innovative. You were creating this wonderful meal. And what happened? The children didn't like it. They wanted hot dogs instead. Now, how do you feel? Shame. So what happens? The children win, and from that point on, you always fix hot dogs. Not a big deal. Throw them in a pot. Whip them up. Here, kid. You see? Vulnerability is the birthplace, the beginning of creativity and courage. Shame keeps us from going there. The fear of shame, the fear of rejection, the fear of not living up to certain standards, not being as great as I thought I was, or as perfect as I thought I was, or, heaven forbid, not being the person I thought I was. And I remember one time counseling with a young lady in my MBA class, and she said growing up was terribly difficult for her. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, my father was a retired Marine Corps drill sergeant. And he expected my sister and I to be absolutely perfect all the time. All the time. We could never let our guard down. And I said, how did that work out for you? And she said, it cost me a lot of years in therapy because I had to learn to accept the fact that I'm not perfect, that I will fail, and that there's growth in failure. She said for my sister, she overdosed on drugs. She took the easy way out. And I could hear the hurt and the sorrow and the shame in her voice. The shame that she had allowed her father to give her that tape. And yet we all have tapes. We all have things that we think about ourselves that are inaccurate, that are impossible to live up to. And at some point, we have to realize that I'm not perfect. God is perfect. I don't want his job. It's too difficult. So as a non-perfect individual, I'm going to make mistakes. There's going to be errors. But, I have to live with that. And I have to live with knowing that at least I tried. And that's what's most important here, I think, is for us to have the courage and the tenacity to take a real good hard look at ourselves and realize that we are the culmination of a lifetime of tapes that we've gotten. Tapes that we started way back when we were very, very little. I would share with you this concept. Way back when you were much too young to be able to decide who and what you were, you asked the question. I mean, you looked at yourself in the mirror and you said, who am I? Who am I? Am I some kind of cosmic joke or something? I mean, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? And so you started collecting information, data from other people, because where else are you going to get your data? And so sometimes that data was a little conflicting. Like mom and dad thought you were perfect and wonderful and great, and your friends all said you're the dumbest thing that ever came along. But you collected data. And then at some point, very early on in your life, well before you had the mentality to do this, you decided, based upon the data you had collected, you decided who and what you were capable of during your lifetime. And then what's really interesting is that your entire life you have gone about collecting data to reinforce that decision you made about yourself. Here's the problem with this whole scenario. The problem is that the data you were collected way back early on was somebody else's perceptions of you. And as we all know, perceptions are not accurate. Think about this. Right now, you're probably sitting in a chair hopefully you're watching this pandemic, and you're sitting perfectly still. And yet we all know that we're on a planet that's spinning at dizzying speeds as it goes through the universe. So perceptions are not accurate. And if you will at least give me that much, then isn't it possible that you are far more intelligent, far more perceptive, far more creative than you ever dreamed possible? But you have to give yourselves the opportunity to go there. You have to give yourself the opportunity to be creative, to be innovative, to be courageous. And that is vulnerability. Vulnerability is our greatest, most accurate measure of courage. Your willingness to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And to do that, you have to be able to overcome your fear of shame and guilt. Because that's where the two come together. You have to give up feeling guilty about keeping yourself from being the person you were meant to be. And you have to forgive yourself for feeling shame, the fear of shame, which has kept you from being the person you were meant to be. You see, they are connected, but they're connected at that one point, the point of vulnerability. And you have control over that. You can decide for yourself how vulnerable you're willing to allow yourself to be. How open to other people are you willing to be? How well are you able to express your feelings? Are you able to feel your feelings? Are you able to recognize your feelings? And are you able to control your feelings and and share with other people. Sharing's a hard thing. It really is. Because you start laying these ideas, these feelings, these thoughts out on the table, and you don't know how other people are going to react to them. And of course, the greatest fear is that you tell someone something and they look at you like you're nuts. Yeah. You remember, don't you guys? 16 years old, maybe younger. First time you told someone, I love you. And they looked at you and went, yeah, right. How'd that make you feel? Yeah. And we carry that the rest of our lives. And so many people are fearful of just saying to someone, I love you. You're a wonderful person. I really feel good while I'm around you. I really love talking to you. I really like being in your presence. I feel, I think, I want. It's hard to share those things with other people unless you feel relatively certain that you know how they're going to respond. Why? Why is it hard to share? Because when you share, you become vulnerable. You open yourself up to someone else, to someone else's opinion, to someone else's perceptions, to someone else's thoughts and feelings about not only about themselves, but about the world. You see, you're taking the chance, you're making the risk. You're taking the risk to lay out your feelings, your thoughts, your beliefs to someone else who has their own feelings, thoughts, and beliefs in the hope that they will understand where you're coming from. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But again, it's your willingness to be vulnerable. You know, when I talk about vulnerability, I keep thinking about this quote. This is called the Man in the Arena quote by Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, to me, summarizes it perfectly. Roosevelt wrote, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled, or where the doer of the deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcomings, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the end, in the worst case, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory or defeat." Roosevelt understood. He understood that it meant what it meant to be in the arena, to be the man with the sweat and the blood, the one who was actually doing the deeds, the one who was actually putting himself out there, being vulnerable. Roosevelt had enormous respect for those people. So, beloved, I would leave you with this message. Dare greatly. Let us pray. Gracious Father, merciful God in heaven, help us, Lord, to be the servants you would have us to be. Father, give us the strength, the courage, the wisdom, and the understanding to overcome our fears, especially those fears of of guilt and shame. Father, strengthen us, lead us, guide us. Help us, Lord, to be the servant you would have us to be. Help us to dare greatly. In Jesus' holy name I pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Beloved, have a wonderful week. Stay out of trouble. Remember that the light of God surrounds you, the love of God enfolds you, the power of God protects you, the presence of God watches over you. Wherever you are, God is. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Be happy. Stay out of trouble. And I will see you right back here next week, same time, same channel. Bye-bye.